Before we start the meeting, let me just note that under the attending physician's guidance, those who are fully vaccinated can now we would ask that you the precautions. So we will ask that the committee come to order, and I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point, and that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and have any written statements be made part of the record. And hearing no objection, that is ordered. Today's hearing continues the oversight of this committee and the House of Representatives of issues related to the January 6th 2021 insurrectionist attack on the Capitol. Specifically, the scope of today's hearing is the latest flash report by the Inspector General for the U.S. Capitol Police, which was provided to congressional oversight committees and the department on June 2nd. This new flash report focuses on 2 issues: the department's Containment Emergency Response Team and its First Responders Unit. Inspector General Bolton's latest flash report, like his 3 previous flash reports, found a number of deficiencies in the programs he reviewed, including significant failings that impacted the ability of the Capitol Police to respond to the January 6th attack and could have put officers at greater risk, as well as the members and staff they sought to protect. His report also makes more than 20 recommendations for addressing these shortcomings. The units he reviewed should have played a key role in stemming the attack and defending the Capitol, but the IG found, among other things, that they lacked sufficient operational planning and a defined mission, while they also suffered from inadequate training and inadequate and ineffective tactical command. We'll hear more about these findings in detail later. Plus, the Inspector General found some information that was so troubling, he determined it was appropriate to alert the department immediately rather than wait a week for the completion of the flash report. Those findings relating to the department's use of a private security company for training raise a number of disturbing questions about institutional decision-making within the department. The IG's findings, like his prior reports, also raise larger questions about accountability within the department. The IG actually made recommendations to improve the CERT team several years ago, but they were not followed. Similarly, when the GAO made recommendations with respect to the department and the Capitol Police Board, they were not followed either. Simply put, many of the shortcomings we will hear about today could and should have been remedied before January 6th. Since January 6th, the day of the insurrection, I've said that Congress should investigate and should form a bipartisan commission to do so. I continue to believe that doing so would provide an important way to give not just Congress, but the American people the unvarnished truth about what happened not just that day, but leading up to the attack. The day of our last hearing on the events of January 6th, the House voted to form just such a commission, and several dozen Republicans voted for that measure. Unfortunately, Senate Republicans then blocked the legislation. One Republican said that Minority Leader Mitch McConnell personally lobbied Republican senators, asking them to oppose a bipartisan commission to get to the truth of the attack as, quote, a personal favor. Subsequently, nearly 90% of Senate Republicans did not vote to form the commission. This is both disappointing and, unfortunately, unsurprising. Since our last hearing, we've continued to learn more about the attack, including the actions of those who carried it out and their goals, as well as the preparation and response of government entities to the insurrection. The criminal investigation and prosecutions related to the attack are already what is being called the most complex investigation ever prosecuted by the Department of Justice. According to senior department officials and court filings, officials have said that scores more are likely to be charged. And at a Judiciary Committee meeting last week, hearing last week, FBI Director Christopher Wray indicated that even more serious charges may be coming. That indictment alleges that from at least November 2020, some of the attackers were planning travel to Washington, D.C. and discussing violence specifically to assist former President Trump's efforts to overturn the election. Their communications were tied closely in time and responded to the former president's call for his supporters to, quote, travel to Washington on January 6th for a big protest that would be, quote, wild. Their communications specifically included discussions of bringing weapons to Washington. Yet at the same time we learn more about the attack, former President Trump and his allies continue to spread misinformation about the 2020 election and downplay the attack or simply deny it occurred. Last month, Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy said, "I don't think anybody is questioning the legitimacy of the presidential election." But 3 days later, the former president, Mr. Trump, himself said, quote, "The presidential election of 2020 will go down as the crime of the century," all caps, and that it was, quote, "by far the greatest election fraud in the history of our country." Now there is even a bizarre emerging myth that the former president will be reinstated in August. One poll this week found that 3 in 10 Republicans believe that conspiracy theory, even though it's a fictitious, non-existent process. In Arizona, more than 7 months after the election, others continued to challenge the results. In Arizona, there's a partisan so-called audit underway, even though Republican state election officials have criticized it. Moreover, Republican officials from other states are now conducting field trips to Arizona to see how they might do the same thing at home. On Sunday, Senator Ron Johnson said that the attackers, quote, weren't rioting. He said that, quote, it doesn't look like when an armed insurrection, when you have people that breach the Capitol, but they're staying within the rope lines in the rotunda. That's not what an armed insurrection would look like. These alternative facts about both the election and January 6th are really unmoored from reality, and they're not just delusional, they're dangerous. We must not lose sight of the fact that whatever institutional shortcomings of the department, the Capitol Police did not incite the insurrectionist attack of January 6th. More than 150 police officers were seriously injured that day, many grievously, and some law enforcement officers lost their lives. Even today, 10 officers still have not been able to return to work because of their injuries. I note that yesterday, for example, proceedings continued in the prosecution of one attacker who stabbed an officer in the face, badly wounding them. We think of the sacrifices these officers made every day. These officers were not attacked and maimed by tourists who stayed within roped-off areas. They were attacked by insurrectionists who brought violence to the Capitol for the purpose of obstructing the peaceful and lawful operation of our government. Most Americans know and understand that the 2020 election was not stolen and that it was the most secure in our nation's history. But in the face of months of gaslighting on a massive historic scale, is it any wonder that a significant number of people believe wrongly that the election was stolen, or that some also believe truly mind-boggling conspiracies like those of the QAnon movement? That's why it's imperative to have an objective, clear-eyed review of what led to the January 6th insurrection. Despite the decision by Senate Republicans to block the formation of a bipartisan commission to review the January 6th attack, this committee has been and remains committed through oversight of the issues within our jurisdiction to find answers. Obviously, the USP management failures did not instigate the riot. Finally, as we begin this hearing, I think it's essential to repeat a point I've made in our previous hearings. Our important and necessary review of the department's performance as an institution and its leadership does not diminish the courage and valor of the men and women who so bravely fought to defend the Capitol on January 6th, or of those from other jurisdictions who responded and sought to hold the line along their brothers and sisters in uniform. And to all officers and civilian employees of the Capitol Police, also to all Ledge Branch staff and members, counseling and other assistance is available to you, and you're recognized to use these resources at any time. I want to note that while we're focusing on the January 6th insurrection, yesterday was the 4th anniversary of the attack of our colleagues who were practicing for the baseball shooting. We want to thank our Capitol Police not only for saving our lives on January 6th, but to helping to save the lives of our colleagues, including the ranking member, Mr. Davis, at that very traumatic event. We thank the Capitol Police for their bravery, for their commitment, and at this point I would like to yield to the ranking member for any comments he may wish to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for recognizing the anniversary of when Barry and I saw what well-trained officers can do when they run toward gunfire so that those innocent can run away from gunfire. Our Capitol Police officers, I couldn't wholeheartedly agree more, Madam Chair, that they deserve our thanks. They're courageous, they're our heroes, and anyone that asks me who my hero is in my life, it will always be David Bailey and Crystal Griner, the two bravest Capitol Police officers I know, although I do enjoy making sure we beat David on the football field in the congressional football game, but you know, that's beside the point. Madam Chair, I want to say thank you. It is great to be back in this hearing room. I want to make sure that you know that you're setting an example to your fellow chairs throughout the House to follow your example, and I think we should all be appreciative of that. There's still work to be done in order to fully reopen, but this, Madam Chair, is a very important step. Now, I want to say, turning to today's hearing, I want to welcome back Inspector General Bolton and also thank Dr. Greta Goodwin from the GAO for her participation here today. For those of you who may not know, in 2017, Dr. Goodwin led the Government Accountability Office's review of the functionality of the Capitol Police Board and determined significant reforms were needed to improve the board's overall performance, transparency, and also to improve their accountability and embrace best practices. Fast forward to more than 4 years after the publication of the GAO's report, the same concerns of poor functionality, the lack of transparency and accountability have been highlighted time and time again in various reviews of January 6th. These are not new issues, but they were highlighted on that terrible day of January 6th. And during previous hearings with Inspector General Bolton, it became apparent that there's virtually no oversight of the Capitol Police Board, a board responsible for nearly every security decision on Capitol Hill. In fact, Inspector General Bolton flat out said that there is no one currently in charge of overseeing the board. In a separate hearing with the architect of the Capitol's Inspector General, it was revealed that the third voting member of the board, the architect for the Capitol, is rarely consulted on board decisions. Then probably the biggest indication of the lack of oversight is that a third of the board declined to appear before this committee when invited. And this is just the public record of the issues with the board. This record doesn't even reflect what I've seen privately. Security decisions being made because of politics, different rules for different parties, and a heavy hand by the Speaker's office. The board is in need of an overhaul, and this committee needs to make this a priority. In my opinion, this should be the first item of business, because any other reforms we recommend that the U.S. Capitol Police make are at risk of not being implemented. The IG has made a number of recommendations to reform the Capitol Police, but if it wasn't apparent before today, it should become very apparent after the GAO's testimony today that the board's approval is required for many, if not most, of these reforms to occur. And if we can't even get the full board to show up to a hearing before this committee, how can we trust that these recommendations will be implemented? Especially since a lot of these recommendations by the IG and the GAO are not new. They've been made before, but have largely been ignored. Last week, I was encouraged by the release of a bipartisan Senate report that, among other things, documented the shortcomings of the Capitol Police Board. While the January 6th review process has been more partisan on the House side, I'm still hopeful we can mirror this kind of bipartisan cooperation, especially when it comes to reforming the Capitol Police Board. The board isn't working. It failed leading up to January 6th. It failed on January 6th, and I fear it's going to fail even after. It's imperative we work together to reform the Capitol Police Board so we can ultimately reform the Capitol Police and strengthen the security on Capitol Hill. Improving functionality, increasing transparency and accountability, and removing politics from the board must be a priority. Or I fear the status quo will just continue, which puts members, staff, and anyone who visits the Capitol at risk. And with that, I look forward to today's discussion, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members' opening statements will be made part of the record. We'd now like to turn to our two witnesses. I'd like to introduce and welcome back Inspector General Bolton, whose work is dedicated to making the department the most effective agency it can be, and introduce and welcome Dr. Greta Goodwin of the Government Accountability Office. Inspector Bolton is no stranger to this committee, and we're grateful for his long career of public service, both in the United States Secret Service and now with the Capitol Police. And Dr. Greta Goodwin is the director of the Homeland Security and Justice team at the GAO, where she leads their work on justice and law enforcement issues. She directed the 2017 review of the Capitol Police Board, as well as reviews on federal tactical teams, the Secret Service, the VA Medical Center Police, among many others. She has a PhD and a master's degree in economics from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Houston. As a reminder to our witnesses, each of you will be recognized for about 5 minutes, and your full statements will be made part of our record. Since we're here in person and not virtually, we'll remind you that there are little machines there on the table. When you have 1 minute left, the light will go yellow, and when it's red, your 5 minutes is up, and we'd ask you to try and sum up at that point. So first, Dr. General Bolton, you are recognized for 5 minutes, and welcome back.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before you, the Committee on House Administration, to discuss our fourth flash report reviewing Containment Emergency Response Team, which we'll refer to as CERT, and the First Responders Unit, FRU. I'd like to extend my appreciation to the committee for holding these additional hearings and the continued support that you have shown my office during this time. I feel that it is the utmost importance to continue exploring and reviewing the causes and failures that led to the horrific events when the Capitol was violently attacked. My goal is to provide each of you with a better understanding how these events occurred in relation to the preparation and response of the department. Other factors were involved and other entities are reviewing those aspects outside of the Capitol Police. I will discuss the non-law enforcement sensitive findings detailed in my fourth flash report. I'll be happy to answer any law enforcement sensitive question in a closed door setting. Once again, I'd like to stress that we did not design or intend our reports to cast blame on any one individual or group. We intend these reports to be an independent, objective review of the department's programs and operations to better protect the Capitol complex, members, staff, and visitors, as well as the rank and file officers. As our work continues, my office sees continuing areas in our findings that the Capitol Police needs to address. These areas are intelligence, training, operational planning, and a cultural change. Our fourth flash report reflects the continuing need for the department to focus on those 4 areas. The department should increase oversight and define a mission for CERT that better supports its primary mission of security and protection of Congress. Realigning CERT from Special Operations Division to a Protective Service Bureau would provide the department more opportunities for using CERT in support of protection details, congressional delegation, air operations, and motorcades. Implementing recurring training between CERT and other Capitol Police elements it may support in assuming a greater role in pursuing appropriate mission-driven training opportunities for CERT from its federal partner agencies would assist the department in developing competencies within CERT that are appropriate for improving the department's ability to achieve its mission. Our review again highlights the areas in which the department needs to address as a whole. Specifically, the department needs to clearly define the mission, expectations, skill sets needed for both CERT and FRU. CERT is not a SWAT team, nor should they ever be considered one. SWAT is a police function, whereas CERT needs to be a tactical team supporting the overall mission of the Capitol Police. The same can be said for the role and responsibilities of FRU. During our review, it was revealed that one of the entities used by CERT for training, Northern Red, had questionable content on its website. During 2018-2019, the department spent $90,000 for CERT to train with Northern Red. The homepage of the company's website uses the motto or slogan, "For those who have hunted armed men, training is never the same." While some of the content could have multiple meanings, their use at department-provided training could lead employees to feel unsafe or uncomfortable. Furthermore, Capitol Police participation at a training Northern Red provided could also lead individuals to believe that Capitol Police sanctions the use of such content. As a result, we issued a management advisory report dated May 26, 2021, to communicate this information to the department and recommended that it reviewed the appropriateness of utilizing Northern Red for further training. As far as the First Responders Unit, FRU, the department did not have adequate policies and procedures for securing ballistic vests strategically stored around the Capitol. In essence, a total of 12 vests and 12 helmets were stolen by the rioters on January 6. Department officials stated that FRU was tasked with their regular duties and was not providing any precautionary information. Some of their vests and helmets were staged at storage cases next to standing posts when the officers had to retreat. As a result of the violent rioters, those ballistic vests and helmets were stolen. In addition, FRU officers are not equipped with adequate less than lethal weapons, such as pepper ball and sting ball systems. They also lacked advanced medical and tactical training. Many of the officers affected by chemical irritants dispatched from the crowd, those officers did not have proper decontamination sites within reach and end up using bottled water or bathroom sinks. In conclusion, the department is comprised of extraordinary men and women who are dedicated to protecting our democracy and have put their lives on the line each and every day. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'll be very happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Inspector General, and now we'll be pleased to hear from you, Dr. Goodwin.
Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee. I am pleased to be here today to talk about how the U.S. Capitol Police can best position itself to respond to the recommendations from various audits. The attack on the Capitol on January the 6th highlighted the critical need to identify and address deficiencies in management and security functions. Various congressional committees and auditing agencies, including GAO, have ongoing work related to the attack. Since the attack, the Capitol Police IG has made over 60 recommendations over 4 reports. Moreover, GAO has an open recommendation to the Capitol Police Board, the entity charged with overseeing the Capitol Police. As auditing agencies make recommendations, it will be important that the Capitol Police work closely with the board, which has varied and wide-ranging oversight roles and responsibilities. My statement today discusses effective practices for addressing recommendations from auditing agencies and GAO's open recommendation to the Capitol Police Board from 2017. Agencies can apply various practices to help them implement recommendations. These practices include: 1, management oversight of the prompt remediation and deficiencies and delegation of authority. This is when management communicates the corrective actions to the appropriate personnel and then delegates authority for completing these actions. 2, regular communication with auditing agencies on the status of recommendations. Engagement between the Capitol Police and leaders of the auditing agencies convey a commitment and attention to implementing recommendations. 3, working with Congress. Congress plays a key role in providing oversight and maintaining focus on recommendations. Federal agencies, including the Capitol Police, are required to report on the implementation status of public recommendations. Further, agencies can assess the need for legislation to address recommendations and report that back to the Congress. And 4, following key organizational transformation practices. As the Capitol Police take steps to implement recommendations, they may benefit from setting goals and a timeline, dedicating a team to manage the transformation process, and involving employees to obtain their ideas and gain their ownership of the transformation. As noted earlier, coordination between the Capitol Police and its board is critical. Given the board's oversight role, the Capitol Police may need approval in order to take actions to address recommendations. GAO's 2017 work on the board assessed whether the board, in fulfilling its oversight role, had developed and implemented policies that incorporated 6 leading practices to facilitate accountability, transparency, and effective external communication. We examined the board's main governing document, its Manual of Procedures, and determined that the manual fully incorporated 1 leading practice and partially incorporated the 5 others. While the manual did develop processes for internal functions of the board, it did not address any board responsibilities in ensuring that audit findings and recommendations to the Capitol Police were promptly resolved. We recommended that the board revise its manual to fully incorporate each of the leading practices to enhance accountability, transparency, and effective external communication. In so doing, we recommended that the board engage with its congressional stakeholders to solicit their input and incorporate their views as appropriate. Since issuing our 2017 report, we have sought updates from the board on the status of the recommendation. As of today, the board has not provided us with any substantive information. Consistent with the practices noted above, communicating regularly with auditing entities on the status of recommendations is important. As the Capitol Police and the board take steps to address deficiencies related to management and security functions, applying the practices we've highlighted will help them be better positioned to respond to current and future recommendations. Chairperson Lofgren, Ranking Member Davis, and members of the committee, this concludes my remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you very much to both of you for your testimony and your willingness to answer our questions. We now will have 5 minutes for each member to ask questions. I'll turn first to our ranking member, Mr. Davis, for whatever questions he may have.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again to both witnesses. Ms. Goodwin, you actually went through a lot of my questions with your testimony. I will try and move on and hopefully not make you repeat, but I think it's pretty telling that you haven't had a lot of cooperation since you begun looking at the Capitol Police Board structure. Is that true?
That's correct, Mr. Davis. So when we issued the report in 2017, as GAO does, it's part of our policy to do follow-up on the recommendations. So we have been attempting to contact the board since 2017, and we've not gotten any substantive information on the status.
So nothing coming from the House Sergeant at Arms, the Senate Sergeant at Arms, the Architect of the Capitol, and the Capitol Police Chief as an ex officio. That's pretty telling. Do you believe that the board has a unique structure when compared to other law enforcement oversight boards that your team researched when drafting the 2017 report?
So in the report, we noted this. So we talked to a number of law enforcement organizations and a number of state legislature organizations about kind of the oversight and the structure of the board. And what we found when we spoke with some of the organizations, it's typical that a board structure like that would have at least 7 members, and it would also have members on the board who would have an expertise in a particular area. For instance, like someone on the board would have expertise in counterterrorism measures. This particular board, as you know, is the Senate Sergeant at Arms, the House Sergeant at Arms, the Architect of the Capitol. They are voting members, and then with the Chief of the Capitol Police, that individual doesn't have is not a voting member.
Right. So, I mean, I want to go back to the board's response to your team's recommendations in the 2017 report, if possible. I think you already answered this, but I want to get it again for the record. Has your office heard from the board on how it plans to implement your recommendations?
We have not. And so,
Go ahead.
so I have a timeline actually of our outreach to the board and their response. And, when we issued the report in February, in April, as GAO does, there's a 60-day letter that the agency responds to us with, outlining how they intend to implement our recommendations, and the board was not very forthcoming. And so then that was in April of 2017, and then we have been doing outreach since then. And so as of today, we've not heard from the board.
Okay. In response to your report, I'd ask Madam Chair unanimous consent to insert into the record the GAO report that Ms. Goodwin, Dr. Goodwin's talking about. Thank you.
Without objection, and perhaps we could have the timeline included as part of that.
Yes, that's absolutely.
Yes, we
Thank
will
you.
make that available, yes.
So where have you seen successful implementation of reforms on a scale similar to what's needed for the Capitol Police?
So as you know, GAO interacts with a number of executive branch agencies, and I'll talk about two that we've seen some success. One of them would be the Department of Homeland Security. And so as I talked about, dedicating a group of people who are engaged in organizational transformation with the Department of Homeland Security, GAO has regular leadership meetings where we have discussions about the recommendations that GAO has issued to the Department of Homeland Security. That has resulted in an over 80% closure rate for those recommendations. We also have regular leadership meetings with the Department of Justice to, again, discuss, the recommendations that we've issued and some other, agency issues. That has also led to an over 80% closure rate for the recommendations. And then one final thing, the head of the Bureau of Prisons, the director of the Bureau of Prisons, recently developed a task force to focus specifically on GAO's recommendations to the Bureau of Prisons. And we have met with that task force, and they look to be on track to addressing many of the recommendations that GAO has put forward to them. So this speaks to, a management commitment and attention to the issues in front of them.
I think it's pretty telling, Dr. Goodwin, that the board has not been responsive. When you tell me about larger agencies being almost 80% responsive to the GAO's recommendations in other audits, I got to ask you one last question. Is the board properly overseen and held accountable for their actions?
So as you know, the board, the committees that oversee the board, they report to this committee, they report to the Senate Rules Committee, and they report to the Legislative Branch Appropriations Committees.
I would argue that would probably be a no, since we're here having this conversation. But I want to say thank you again. I think your report is telling. I think there's a lot of work this committee needs to do, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, is now recognized.
Madam Chair, thank you, and thank you for calling this extremely important hearing. Inspector General Bolton, just over a month ago, a Capitol officer was suspended after it was found he was perusing an infamous anti-Semitic forgery in Screed, the Protocols of Elders of Zion, at a screening checkpoint at the Capitol. It also came out that there is a company, Northern Red, which uses images that are deployed by Nazis and white supremacists, that was contracting with the department. I wondered how these incidents have affected public confidence in the department and what's being done to counter the image that there's a problem there.
Thank you, sir. Well, certainly I can't speak to public confidence in what they have with the Capitol Police. On your first point, that officer, I believe that's still under investigation by the Office of Professional Responsibility, so I don't think it has been concluded yet on his actions there. In regards to Northern Red imageries and symbols that were found on their website, that's one of the reasons we issued that management advisory report in order to bring that to the attention of the Capitol Police, which has kind of prompted for my FY 2022 annual plan, we will be looking at the Capitol Police's any outside training companies that they're utilizing and take a look at every single one of them and make sure that they at least are aligned with what they need to be doing.
Well, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have described domestic violent extremism and racially motivated violent extremists as a #1 security threat to the American people in the country. They've also identified deliberate recruitment of law enforcement officers as one of the strategies being used by white supremacist groups. So I'm wondering whether you think that association with entities that are using racist insignia and so on creates a security risk for the Capitol Police.
It could create a security risk. Could also just the viewing of it or seen by the public, whether they feel that they are condoning it or participating in or assisting these. There certainly raises the questions, and that's the reason we brought it to the attention of the department. That these are questions that are not. We haven't said that the Northern Red is a group one way or the other.
Yeah.
It's just it causes concerns and a question to be raised.
There's been some reporting that Northern Red has been used by some other federal agencies and departments as well as the Capitol Police Department. Have you been in contact with other agency officials about Northern Red and whether they in fact are being used and whether their use is being reviewed? I
did send a notification to the Inspector General of the Department of Justice with our attachment of our management advisory report, providing him that information for action as he deems appropriate. Beyond
this particular potential involvement of groups like that, I'm troubled by the fact that CERT needs to utilize private contractors to meet basic training needs. Northern Red's headquartered in North Carolina, its training facilities in Danville, Virginia, about 250 miles from here, a 10-hour round trip from D.C. By comparison, the FLETC facility in Cheltenham, Maryland is about 16 miles away. The U.S. Secret Service training facility in Beltsville, Maryland is 15 miles from here. And the Quantico FBI Academy is just 40 miles from the Hill. So why is CERT utilizing private contractors for training in the first place, especially ones that are so far away? Well, what they relay to us is that their inability to be able to schedule that training with our federal partners. Hence why. Did you pursue that? Well, that's one of the reasons we made our recommendation is that Training Services Bureau should be the ones that are actually scheduling the training, reaching out, creating those partnerships. When you go from one training branch to another training branch, whether it be Raleigh Training Center, Quantico, that they form a partnership and a bond and would facilitate getting that kind of training and utilizing those facilities as opposed to CERT on its own trying to schedule those. Yeah, it just seems to me that there are better law enforcement and Department of Defense entities that CERT could leverage for training purposes than some of these that are more far-flung and that have very questionable relationships, shall we say. Let's see, I see my time has expired, and I want to thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both for the work that you've been doing and being here today. It was brought up earlier, June the 14th, 2017. Rodney and I were on the baseball field when a man crazed by political ideology came on the field and tried to kill many of us. I've got several members of my family who are in professional security services. I have friends and colleagues that do executive protection and those type of services. And many had questioned the Capitol Police ability to protect members of Congress ever since I've been in Congress. They were surprised that when we leave Capitol Hill, that we, even when large groups, we didn't have any type of protection. And if you think about it, had not Steve Scalise been at practice that day, there would have been no one there when the shots were being fired. It would have been a massacre if it had not have been a member of leadership who had a protective detail. Hindsight, we have changed some of the things that we do for protection of members of Congress to where now at baseball practice we have a team there with us that goes before and they secure the field. So there was corrective actions taken, is my point. Dr. Goodwin, on January 6th, we witnessed the same kind of confusion and bureaucratic paralysis and lack of transparency that really you warned about in your report. Okay? So even though maybe on the baseball field there wasn't some type of formal warning that we needed more security, you gave that warning. It's been insinuated that the problems with the board are personality-driven and not structurally driven. In your expert opinion, are those personality or structural problems?
Thank you for that question. So our report didn't look at personalities, but we did look at the structure. And, you know, if you think about, you know, the Sergeant at Arms reports to one chamber, the House Sergeant at Arms, the Senate Sergeant at Arms reports to one chamber, the House Sergeant at Arms reports to another. The Architect of the Capitol, and then you've got the Chief of Police. And so there were some concerns. We met with a number of stakeholders from the different committees that the board reports to. And there were some concerns about, well, if maybe one Sergeant at Arms is more concerned with their reporting chamber as opposed to the other reporting chamber, there could be a little confusion or lack of a flow of information across, back and forth. And one of the things we talk about when we talk about effective external communication, on January the 6th, the board, as you know, was asked to call up the National Guard. And there, from the Senate reporting, there was some confusion about who does what and what happens when. And so our report wouldn't speak to whether, January 6th, what would have happened on January 6th had they followed our recommendation. But what our report does help with is just more robust lines of communication between the board and the congressional committees that it reports to, between the board and the Congress in general, so that the Congress would have a better sense for how the board works, how the board is structured, and what are the functions of the board.
Thank you. And also in your report, you say that the board's responsibilities have an atypical and wide-ranging scope for an oversight body, and that some groups, if you've interviewed, saw it as an anomaly. What are some of the unique elements of the board that make it, as some have said, an anomaly?
Yeah, so the board has wide-ranging roles and responsibilities that are more unique than what would happen with other law enforcement entities. They have a lot of input and role on the hiring, the management. They have a lot of input and role on the type of training. And the fact that the Chief of Police reports, sits on the board, but has to seek approval for certain things that a typical Chief of Police wouldn't have to seek approval for. Such
as calling in the National Guard? Is that one of the things that this unique structure has caused?
It could be. I don't want to say that because we didn't specifically look at that particularly as it relates to January the 6th. But the fact that the Chief of the Capitol Police has to seek approval and from the other members of the board is something that might hamper their ability to move forward a little faster.
Thank you. In your report, you say that officials from expert groups emphasize the importance of having clearly defined roles and responsibilities between the oversight body and the Chief of Police. Did your team find in 2017 that the board members had a good understanding of their roles and responsibilities?
I would say we found that the board had a good understanding of their roles and responsibilities in relation to their interaction with the various congressional committees. Not all of the stakeholders that we spoke to had an understanding of the board's roles and responsibilities. For example, if you just think about the manual of procedures, the board is required to at least, alert the different congressional committees that the manual is available, and then they, the committees can ask for the manual, and the board will make that available. Some of the stakeholders we spoke to weren't aware of that. Some of the stakeholders we spoke to had not seen the manual, and so, and that was something that came up quite a bit. Like, what does the board make available to the different congressional committees? How do the congressional committees go about getting information from the board? We also had some stakeholders who felt like they had good relationships with the board. They were constantly interacting with them. But, one of the leading practices is communicating with all of your stakeholders.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Butterfield is now recognized. And congratulations once again, Mr. Butterfield is newlywed.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. May 31st was a great day in my life. Thank you so very much. And thank you for convening this hearing. This is a series of hearings that are absolutely necessary, and just thank you for pulling this all together. And thank you for an in-person hearing. I know you and I have been talking about this back and forth, and Mr. Davis has been talking about it now for several weeks. And I promised you, Rodney, we would be back together sooner than you knew. And so it's good to be back together, and thank you for challenging us, Mr. Davis. And so my challenge in return is to ensure that every member and every witness and every participant in this hearing is vaccinated. Please, please, if you have not had the vaccination, please get it. It's absolutely necessary. My favorite saying is that I have 2 houses, 2 cars, $2, but 1 life, and I want to protect that life. So please, if you have not been vaccinated, please do so. Thank you to the witnesses. Thank you both. I have read your resume as I sat up here. General Bolton, of course, I've seen you time and time again, but thank both of you for your testimony. Your resumes are absolutely stellar. You are the epitome of excellence. This is what we need in this institution. General Bolton, according to your report, the first responders unit was assigned, quote, regular duties and had not been provided any precautionary information or guidance in advance of the January 6th joint session. My question to you, sir, is should the first responders unit have been provided additional information and additional guidance in advance of January 6th?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
And who within the department leadership would have been responsible for preparing the first responders with this special information and guidance?
Well, ultimately, if you look at the chain of command, ultimately, it's the chief's responsibility. But it goes, I think, further than that. It goes back to initial reports that we've covered with the operational planning for that day, where they had the CDU operational plan, which really didn't include the first responders unit, didn't really include CERT, didn't really include any other elements. It goes back to having that operational planning and utilizing all of the elements within the Capitol Police in a one concerted effort to provide security, as opposed to having these autonomous units independently operating without the one unit knowing what the other unit is doing. So it ultimately, yeah, it would be the chief, but then also the assistant chief of Uniform Branch or the Uniform Services Bureau would be basically in charge of making sure those plans are carried out and implemented.
Would it be an overstatement to say that this was a failure on the part of the department to prepare and train and equip a specialized unit?
Yes, sir, I would agree with that assessment.
It would be a failure?
Yes, sir.
All right. You also found that the department did not have a policy mandating that officers within the unit be certified on the M4 rifle, which these officers carry while standing posts or at the barriers. What are the ramifications for the unit officers failing to be certified on this high-powered rifle?
To put it as bluntly as possible, devastating, not only for the department, but for innocent individuals. We are in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, close area within the Capitol complex. You have many visitors, so it would be a devastating event if they weren't used appropriately.
Dr. Goodwin, thank you for your testimony, and your resume was absolutely impeccable, and thank you for your incredible work over the years. Do you have any reflections on how our recent national conversation on policing would have informed your views on the GAO Capitol Police Board report if that conversation had taken place 5 years ago when the report was written?
I don't at this moment. I will say that GAO has ongoing work looking at the events of January the 6th, and I can talk about those briefly. We also have ongoing work looking at law enforcement use of force overall. And I think that those will absolutely inform any work we do on this topic going forward.
And the final question, General Bolton, and I wrote it down, it wasn't in my prepared questions, but something I've always been curious about. Did the insurrectionists have firearms?
I believe there were several firearms recovered. There was also a vehicle that had stashed firearms within the Capitol complex. My understanding, there were arrests made that individuals did have firearms.
22 pistols or more power than that?
You mean 22 caliber?
Yes.
Well, I believe there were higher caliber than that, sir.
That's what I'm believing. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
When yields back, Mr. Stiles recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I extend my congratulations to you, Mr. Butterfield. Congratulations again. I'm excited we're here in person. Let me dive in, if I can, Mr. Bolton. You've issued a total of 65 recommendations to the United States Capitol Police. We commend the efforts of you and your team. Have you seen an overarching strategy for how these recommendations are to be implemented in a systematic way?
No, sir, I have not. Although the department has just recently requested the closure of several recommendations on our second flash report. And we did close 2 recommendations related to the first flash report. But that's not something that the department probably would share unless requested. But I do know that they do send over an updated report every week to the Capitol Police Board.
So safe to say some of these recommendations have been made, but you've not seen a systematic approach to addressing the number of items that you've identified for them.
That would be correct.
And how many times have you met with the United States Capitol Police to discuss the recommendations that you and your office have made since January 6th?
I believe it would be, well, met with the audit liaison, or my folks in my office have contacted the audit liaison to get updates on the status of recommendations, but I have not met personally with the command staff.
So you personally have not met with the command staff since January 6th, and how many times have you met with the Capitol Police Board since January 6th?
During the normal course of the Capitol Police Board meetings, I believe it was either 2 or 3 times.
2 or 3 times. Let me shift gears to you, Ms. Goodwin. I appreciate you being here and your work as well. Would you say that the recommendations issued by the Inspector General are important for ensuring that the United States Capitol Police is operating by industry best standards and is held accountable?
Yes.
And who is directly responsible for overseeing the United States Capitol Police Board?
So that would
Or
be...
the United States Capitol Police, excuse me.
Oh, the Capitol...
I led the witness.
So this committee, the Senate Rules Committee, and the Legislative Branch Appropriations Committee, those are the 4 committees that the Capitol Police Board report to.
But in the United States Capitol Police.
The Capitol Police report to the board. And also, Mr. Bolton reports to the board. So that's something that could also be an issue. All of these entities are reporting to the board. The board is then, of course, reporting to you all. But the communication, I think, between the committees and the board could be better.
I think it could be better for sure, to say that lightly. Is it the board's responsibility to ensure that the recommendations issued by the Inspector General are implemented and corrective action is taken?
So the Capitol Police would work closely with the board on any of the recommendations that come their way. Given the recommendation that we made to the board was about their manual and just, to think through the different ways that they can help the police respond to some of the recommendations.
Understood, knowing I only get 5 minutes on this, but is it ultimately the board's responsibility to ensure that those recommendations are actually implemented?
It would be.
Corrective action is taken?
It would be.
It would be. And is it considered in industry best practice that the Oversight Board have such regulations in their bylaws, or in this case in the manual, in regards to actually implementing these recommendations?
So when we looked at the manual, as noted earlier, we looked at, we put up some of the leading practices up against the manual to see where the manual fell out. What's important here is when the board revised the manual back in 2003, they used some of the same leading practices. In their agency comments to GAO, they took issue with the leading practices that we used, but of course those were the same leading practices that they had used to revise the manual.
And do you think that the current version should be further updated in their manual, that the board should further update their manual?
I would leave that up to the board.
Okay, because I believe in page 21 of your report, you indicate as such, correct?
Yeah.
And I'd like to
But that was
put
from-
forth into the record that report, which I believe is there in particular.
The ranking member has already put it in.
He's already submitted it. Spectacular. Thank you. So in my quick remaining time, Mr. Bolton, in our hearing, we discussed your first flash report. I asked you about recommendations from your office that were not fully implemented. Can you confirm that recommendations from the OIG are still not being fully implemented by the Capitol Police?
Well, they're in the process of implementing some of the recommendations that we put forth in all our flash reports. Obviously, some of the recommendations that involve budgetary concerns or approval for reorganization, those that, will be decided either through appropriations and/or the board.
I appreciate that. And in recognition of the time that I have, just to recap, I think what we're seeing here is that the board should have responsibility to oversee the audits of the U.S. Capitol Police, but the requirement to oversee the implementation of the Inspector General's recommendation is really not included in the board's manual. In all four USCP OIG flash reports, the AOC OIG flash report, General Honore's report, and the Senate report show a failure of leadership and a lack of oversight. And I remain concerned about the structure of the board and its oversight. And with that, Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Bolton, I wanted to go back a little bit to what Mr. Raskin was asking you about, which is why the Capitol Police chose to contract with Northern Red, the private company whose website included the imagery of a Norse, Nazi, and white supremacist iconography. It's deeply disturbing that our police officers could have been trained by the same individuals or by individuals who share the same ideology that led to the attack on January 6th. But I wanted to ask specifically, what can you share additional details about why you felt, why you were compelled to issue the advisory report instead of just waiting for the flash report? Why did you feel compelled to do that, in lieu of, or in addition to, I should say?
One, given the fact that we are coming out of this pandemic where training may start back up, I felt it was necessary to alert the department as quickly as possible once we came across that information. So if they had plans on continuing to use this company, that we could put a stop to it immediately. What concerned us was that, for instance, the patches that they had, the Devil's Guard. I know I have a lot of time to explain, but it was based on a 1971 book about a Nazi SS soldier who, after the war, escaped and joined the Foreign Legion and went to Vietnam and was fighting there, but believed in asymmetrical warfare and utilization of hostages for civilian and/or other tactics. But them having that prominently displayed within their website caused us enough to have concerns and questions that we need. That's why we felt compelled to issue that prior to even issuing our flash report. I wanted to get that immediately to them because they had used them approximately 4 times in 2019 and twice in 2018.
Do you feel that using this contract could have negatively impacted the officers, in their training? You mentioned that they could feel uncomfortable, or individuals could feel uncomfortable dealing with that. Could it have affected their training negatively as a result?
It may or may not. I couldn't definitively answer that question. I just think the appearance of it raises issues and concerns that there are better options of doing training. And one of the reasons our recommendations was that the department needs to clearly define what the role and responsibility and skill sets that CERT needs to have. Once the department defines it, then they should give it to the Office of Training, our Training Services Bureau, and say, here, come up with the training scenarios, the lesson plans. They control the training, not the individual unit.
We know training is a key point that you've highlighted in all of these flash reports of a key deficiency. Director Goodwin, based on your experience, what contracting practices are utilized by other federal law enforcement agencies to prevent contracting with companies that could have ties to domestic extremism?
Congressman, I'll have to circle back to you on that one. I know that we've done some work on that, but I'm not familiar enough right now, so I will circle back to you.
Okay. Thank you so much. Mr. Bolton, can I go back to the weapons certification piece? The report mentions CERT officers failed to complete the required qualifications on their assigned weapons from 2018 to 2020. 29 CERT officers, required to meet quarterly qualifications on handguns. 22 of the 29 failed to meet those. In response to Mr. Butterfield, you talked about how urgent this was. Is it possible that the department failed to use an appropriate level of force against the armed violent rioters on January 6th because they were not confident in their firearms training, qualifications, or abilities?
Sir, I have absolutely no information that could support that or contradict that statement, sir.
In response to Mr. Butterfield, you said this was alarming, that this was a huge deficiency.
Correct.
For the CERT officers who failed to complete the required certifications from 2018 to 2020, were there any repercussions, any infractions, or how did the department, deal with those deficiencies?
As far as we know, and for the information we have, there were no actions taken against the officers. From my previous employer, the Secret Service, if you had not met your qualifications, you weren't allowed to be operational at that point until you met your qualification requirements.
I don't know any local law enforcement agency that doesn't have similar protocols. As a former local mayor, as someone who spent some time with local law enforcement agencies, I think that's pretty common practice, and I think it's unfortunate and shocking that we don't have similar guidance here. Thank you so much both for your testimony and for being here. Yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And thank you, Inspector Bolton, and thank you both for joining us again today. As with your past flash reports, this latest report has identified serious failings with respect to USCP training, leadership, and procedures that contributed to the breach of the Capitol on January 6th. I want to stress our determination to examine both the origins of the January 6th attempt to disrupt the joint session of Congress and the logistical issues that almost allowed that insurrection to succeed. We must hold those responsible accountable. I also want to acknowledge again that the brave officers of the U.S. Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police rose to defend our democracy, the Capitol, and those who serve it, despite the lack of planning and leadership which you've detailed. And the only meaningful way to express our gratitude is to address the multiple issues that left them so exposed and unprepared for the violent mob which the former president sent to the Capitol on January 6th. So I'd like to look at some of your conclusions in the June flash report about the lack of coordination and strategic planning between the various departments and agencies under USCP, particularly the department's Containment Emergency Response Team, or CERT, and the First Responder Unit. Now, Inspector Bolton, according to your report, a Special Ops Division official requested CERT support several times for officers in the rotunda on January 6th. And this is substantiated by CERT radio traffic channels that were reviewed by OIG investigators. A CERT official responded in person, but without other CERT personnel. That official then stated they didn't want to deploy less than lethal munitions because, quote, they didn't want people falling down the steps, end quote. Were you able to determine why the CERT official refused to use less than lethal munitions to defend the Capitol and its occupants against the mob?
As best we can discern is that because there was no overarching plan, coordination by the officials, by command staff, CERT was left on its own to make the decisions as they were. So they were looking for the command staff to provide them with general direction and/or orders to utilize those munitions. There was a radio also traffic. Basically, one of the CERT operators was saying, well, if they're not going to give us an order to utilize these munitions, then what's the point of us being here anyway?
Okay.
Not a direct quote, but that is basically the gist of it. And that seems to be the problem, because there was no unified plan incorporating all the elements. FRU did not know what CERT was going to do. CERT didn't know what FRU was going to do. None of the elements within the Capitol Police knew what the other elements were going to be doing.
Well, after being denied assistance by CERT, that official was met by a tactical team from another federal agency, which offered assistance. And why would a partner agency be ready to use less than lethal munitions while the Capitol Police were not?
Basically because they were trained to be able to do that type of work.
Okay. And so then we're clear that the department doesn't train all of its officers to do that kind of work, to use in the use of force matrix?
Well, I would say for the particular set of skills that was required for that point, they weren't trained or properly equipped to handle that situation. Hence why, again, the department needs to define clearly the specific skill sets and expectations for their units.
You also state in your report that CERT never trains with CDU and that CERT would wing it during a deployment, it literally wing it, if CERT had to assist CDU because of the lack of coordination between them. Should a specialized unit within a law enforcement entity ever wing it?
Never wing it.
I didn't think so. Who should have facilitated coordination between CERT and CDU?
Well, I think that becomes the problem because where CERT is located in the Special Operations Division, our recommendation is that they move to the Protective Services Bureau, where they would directly assist and support the protective agency model, and that's what they are. Because again, as I try to reiterate, they are not SWAT. They need to be a tactical team to support the mission of the Capitol, which needs to be decided by the command structure.
Okay. Your report says that CERT operates in an autonomous manner while planning for major events, and that it came up with its own plans for January 6th. Did you or your investigators receive any documentation from CERT outlining its autonomous plans for January 6th? And if so, what members of the department's senior leadership approved of that plan?
There was no approval by senior leadership. The plan basically consisted of truck assignments. Who was going to be assigned to which vehicle is basically, that was their plan.
There were no trucks in the rotunda on January 6th?
Not to my knowledge, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Are there dangers of an enhanced tactical component like CERT freelancing during critical incidents like January 6th?
There is potential, whether it be friendly fire or conflict of movements. There could be issues if you're not a coordinated plan.
I don't know. I haven't been looking at
The
time.
gentlelady's time has expired.
I was afraid of that. Thank you. I
Thank
yield
you. The
back.
gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you, Chair Lofgren, for holding this important hearing, and to our witnesses for sharing your insight and findings. Inspector General Bolton, your most recent flash report only adds to the outrage and disappointment about how poorly our former Capitol Police leadership was prepared to withstand a violent assault on this building and on our democracy. But, as I read these reports and as we ask our questions, I always must remember that former President Trump and those who abetted his lie that the election was stolen, that was what caused the death, violence, and destruction on January 6th, as those rioters responding to Trump sought to prevent Congress from certifying the election. And I agree that a bipartisan commission would be the appropriate method for understanding the full nature, web, and ongoing threat from those who participated in and fomented the attack. Recognizing the heroism of our Capitol Police must also include acting in a bipartisan way to get to the bottom of January 6th, as those very officers who were heroes have asked us to do, have pleaded with us to do. But we're focused now on what this committee can do to address the failures in leadership and training of the Capitol Police so that we're better prepared because we continue to receive multiple threats from the far right, the conspiracy theorists, and those who still believe or advocate the lie about the president-elect election. Like my colleagues, I'm quite disturbed that CERT used Northern Red with its overt white supremacist markings for private training. Inspector General, I'll just ask a few follow-up questions on that. You know, I'm wondering about the morale. You know, I often ask about what do some of these issues have on the morale, especially among those Capitol Police of color who had to undergo the racist and vile attacks on their persons and who they were. What kind of impact on the morale does using Northern Red have on those officers?
Well, I can't speak specifically for each individual officer, obviously, but certainly when you have these kind of questions, it's going to affect morale because either the embarrassment factor or the concerning factor that the officers may feel, again, that the department is placed under a not so favorable light. Some of those questions I may be able to provide you in our next report because we'll be interviewing individual officers, not so much specifically about Northern Red, but just getting them that overall feeling and their morale based on the events that occurred January 6th, and certainly they may express other views as well. So we're in the midst of starting to interview the individual officers during that day. So maybe I'll give you a better understanding in our next flash report.
I really appreciate that. Do you know who was responsible for the decision to contract with Northern Red?
Well, the initial was the lieutenant who was in charge of CERT, but it did go up the chain of command. It was authorized by the then Chief Rosa that authorized the utilization of Northern Red, as well as at that time, the Assistant Chief Son.
Thank you. And regarding going back to the 4 flash reports and the over 60 recommendations in those flash reports, I was wondering if you could opine on, based on your interviews of the new leadership, the new Police Chief Pittman and the new House Sergeant of Arms Walker, whether you believe those recommendations can be implemented so that this building, our members, staff, and guests are protected.
I believe that there's no reason why the recommendations can't be implemented and we can't move forward. Certainly, it's a question of understanding your weaknesses, acknowledging them, and putting forth the work to accomplish your task and goals.
And I look forward to hearing precisely what you believe Congress can do in our role to make sure we can implement those. Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Just a couple of concluding questions. On the Northern Red issue, Mr. Inspector General, you were concerned enough about this that you contacted the department before. It was only a week until your flash report was out, so obviously you had some concern about this and the displays, the symbols that are connected to Nazis and white supremacists. We haven't done a complete research job on this entity. I want to emphasize that. But is it possible that, well, let me withdraw that question because I am concerned that the department responded very, with tremendous force to essentially peaceful protesters under Black Lives Matter the year before, and yet we had a riot of white supremacists and there was no reaction. And I'm wondering if the training by an organization that maybe had those ties had an impact on that disparate understanding of what the risk was. Is that possible?
That would be hard to answer, Madam Chair. There are a lot of other factors involved. We have not uncovered any information that would support that the CERT previously knew that what these symbols, in fact, we had to look them up in this.
Okay. All right. Let me go to the CERT commander. According to your report, the CERT commander was supposed to be in the command center, but instead he deployed with his unit. Well, I mean, obviously one can respect the bravery of that officer while questioning the judgment in that decision. But I'm wondering, what's the purpose of having the CERT commander in the command center? Does the department have a written policy dictating where the CERT commander should be during an incident like this? And can you figure out why the CERT commander chose not to be present in the command center?
To answer your question, the department does have a written policy that the CERT commander will be in the command center during these events, whether it be like the State of the Union or inauguration or other such events. The purpose of the CERT commander to be in the command center is to coordinate any responses by other tactical units that are coming onto the Capitol complex. That way they can assist them and whatever they're coming to this complex for to assist us to coordinate those efforts. As far as the reasons for why the commander of CERT decided to be within or around the interior of the Capitol, that I'm not sure.
Okay. Do you think the absence of the CERT commander from the command center impacted the department's ability to respond to the mob and to communicate and coordinate with other law enforcement entities?
Well, certainly to communicate with other law enforcement agencies. Your first part, it had to be difficult to answer because, one, there was no plan to utilize CERT to begin with.
I see.
So it would be hard to say that would have made much of a difference.
I'll just join in Mr. Aguilar's astonishment about the lack of certification. I was in local government for 14 years before I ran for Congress. We had oversight over the sheriff's department. I've never heard of such a thing where the officers don't meet. I mean, matter of fact, they're anxious about it. They're constantly going to the range to make sure that they keep their certification current, because otherwise they're out of a job. And it's just astonishing that that was not the case here. But let's go back to the CERT issue. I know that there were individual officers assigned to, for example, the vice president during the day, but you point out in your report that the CERT did not participate as an entity in the leadership evacuations. Do you think that that lack of participation in leadership evacuations put congressional leadership or potentially even the vice president in danger?
That would be a law enforcement sensitive, but to answer somewhat is that it is a concern that they weren't there.
All right. Let me ask you, if we had moved away from the traditional police department into the posture of a protective agency, as their strategic plan directed them to do, would that have had an impact, you think, on CERT's duties on the day? And should this shift impact the first responder unit's duties?
If we move to a protective agency model, all elements within the Capitol Police should be affected, because then now you're aligning them into a different mode of operation, a different mindset. That you are in a protective mode, you're not a law or traditional police department, that now you have a defined, clear understanding of your roles and responsibilities, and we can also train those individuals for that skill set.
Thank you. I see that my time has expired, so I just would be remiss if I didn't thank you also, Dr. Goodwin, for being here. We appreciate your report, and I'm mindful we may be asking you some advice even off camera, because it's hard to change a statute, but there's plenty of room to make accommodations and to make improvements without going through all of that. In fact, the police board has done that in terms of authorizing the chief of police to utilize the National Guard. So we'll use your report as a roadmap, but also we might seek your help in how the board might take up best practices in the most efficient way possible. I want to thank both of you for appearing, as well as the members. As we know, the hearing record will be held open so that members may offer additional questions to you, and if we do, we ask that you answer those questions promptly. And there being no further business before the committee, without objection, this hearing is adjourned.